In 1890, one man owned 90% of all the oil on Earth. He could have bought entire countries. He could have started wars with a single signature. But people did not fear him for his money. They feared him for what he was willing to do to get it. Imagine a man whose fortune, in today's money, would be worth $400 billion, more than Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos combined, more than the GDP of most nations on this planet. He did not just control a business. He controlled the light in every home in America, the fuel in every lamp, the grease in every machine, the price of every product that moved on a railroad anywhere in the United States. They called him a devil. They called him a genius. They called him a savior and a tyrant, and the most dangerous man alive. Journalists wrote articles demanding his imprisonment. Presidents considered him an enemy of democracy. Small business owners wept in courtrooms, describing what he had done to their livelihoods. And through all of it, through every accusation and every investigation and every moment of public fury directed at him, he sat quietly, still, pale blue eyes resting on nothing in particular, a thin smile on his lips. He built an empire that still shapes the world today, even though most people cannot name it, even though its original form was torn apart by the Supreme Court of the United States. Even though 100 years have passed, and the name Standard Oil has faded from daily conversation. The companies it became, the pipelines it laid, the methods it pioneered, the template it created for what a corporation could be and do and take, all of it is still here, still running, still underneath everything. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, the man who bought the world. And it begins, like all the darkest stories begin, not with power, but with hunger, not with an empire, but with a boy. A boy who grew up in a house full of secrets, raised by a father who taught him that the world was a place to be taken rather than lived in, and a mother who taught him that God was watching everything he did and expected him to be worthy of the watching. Those two lessons taken together made him the most dangerous man in American history. Let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to a dirt road in rural New York, sometime in the 1840s, where a large and handsome and deeply dishonest man is climbing onto a wagon and preparing to disappear again, the way he always did, for weeks or months at a time, leaving behind a wife and children and debts and questions that nobody was supposed to ask out loud. His name was William Avery Rockefeller, but the people who knew him, the people who had genuine reason to know him well, they had another name for him. They called him Devil Bill. And everything John D. Rockefeller ever became started with watching that man drive away. In a small town in upstate New York, there lived a man who could sell anything to anyone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that immediately made people trust him. The kind of handsome that seems to promise reliability and warmth and good humor. He laughed easily and often. He told stories that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting him. He had large hands and an easy confidence, and a way of looking at you that made you feel, somehow, that you were the most interesting person he had encountered in years. His name was William Avery Rockefeller, and he was a fraud. Not occasionally, not in moments of weakness or desperation, systematically, professionally, as a matter of daily practice and personal philosophy. He sold patent medicines from the back of a wagon, bottles of colored water and alcohol, and vague promises that he marketed as cancer cures. He charged $5 a bottle, an enormous sum for the 1840s, to desperate people with real diseases who had nowhere else to turn. He took their money with a warm smile and a firm handshake, and drove his wagon to the next town before the medicine failed to work and the questions started. He called himself, depending on the day and the audience, a doctor, a merchant, a businessman, a land speculator. He was none of these things. He was a con man, one of the best of his generation, and he was completely, serenely unapologetic about it. There is a quote attributed to Devil Bill that has survived through the generations, passed down through accounts of people who knew him, and it is one of the most revealing sentences in this entire story. He reportedly said of his own children that he cheated them every chance he got. He wanted to make them sharp. He wanted them to see the world clearly, without the comfortable illusions that made ordinary people easy to exploit. He believed, with a genuine and unsentimental conviction, that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who took and those who were taken. And he was determined that no child of his would end up in the second category. This was John Rockefeller's first education. Not school, though he attended school dutifully and was a serious and disciplined student. Not church, though his mother Eliza took the children to Baptist services with a regularity that bordered on the devotional. His first real education, the one that shaped the architecture of his thinking at the deepest level, was watching his father operate. Watching a man move through the world with complete confidence in his own superiority. Watching him identify what people wanted, what they feared, what they needed badly enough that they would suspend their better judgment to get it. And then watching him give them just enough of the appearance of that thing to take their money and move on. John was the second of 6 children. He was born on July 8, 1839, in a farmhouse in Richford, New York. He was a quiet child, serious in a way that made adults slightly uncomfortable, the way that very serious children always make adults slightly uncomfortable, as if they suspect the child of understanding more than it should. He watched everything. He asked few questions out loud, but his pale eyes moved constantly, cataloguing, assessing, filing away information with a thoroughness that would have been remarkable in a trained accountant and was extraordinary in a boy of 7 or 8. He watched his father charm and deceive, and he watched his mother endure. Eliza Davison Rockefeller was everything her husband was not. Where he was loud, she was quiet. Where he was present only intermittently, vanishing for weeks at a time on his wagon routes and returning with money and stories and the smell of other places, she was constant, absolutely, unwaveringly constant. She raised the children with a strict Baptist faith that organized time itself around the rhythms of prayer and scripture and Sunday service. She kept the household running on whatever money William left behind, which was sometimes generous and sometimes nothing at all, with an efficiency and a dignity that never let the children feel the precariousness of their situation. She gave John 2 things that his father could not or would not give him. The first was God. A genuine, practical, daily relationship with God, not as an abstract theological concept, but as a real presence who observed everything and kept accounts. The Baptist faith that Eliza raised her children in was not a comfortable religion. It demanded honesty and discipline and genuine accountability. It believed that how you conducted your daily life, every transaction, every relationship, every hour of every day, was a form of worship or its opposite. That God was watching not just your prayers, but your ledger books, not just your Sunday mornings, but your Monday afternoons. John took this seriously. He took it more seriously than perhaps anyone in his family expected him to. He kept, from the age of 16, a small leather ledger book that he called his account book, in which he recorded every penny he earned and every penny he spent and every penny he gave to charity. He tithed from his very first paycheck. Before he had enough money to feed himself reliably, he was giving 10% of everything he earned to his church. This was not performance. Nobody was watching. It was private and consistent and lifelong. He called it his duty, and he never wavered from it. The second thing Eliza gave him was a model of endurance, of how to survive a world that was unreliable and sometimes cruel, without becoming either broken or bitter. She did not complain about William's absences or his deceptions or the particular cruelty of a husband who, it would eventually emerge, was living a double life so complete that it constituted an entirely separate existence. She simply continued, day after day, meal after meal, prayer after prayer. The world was what it was, and you met it with whatever you had, and you kept going. John learned both lessons completely. From his father he learned that the world was a game, and that the player who understood its real rules, not the stated rules, but the actual operating principles beneath the surface, would always defeat the player who believed the stated rules were real. He learned that sentiment was a vulnerability, that relationships were leverage, that the appearance of warmth and the reality of warmth were 2 entirely different things, and that only one of them was useful. From his mother he learned discipline, consistency, the power of showing up every day and doing the same things in the same way, regardless of how you felt or what the circumstances were. He learned that God was watching the ledger book as closely as the prayer book. He learned that giving was not weakness, but strategy, a way of aligning yourself with something larger than your own ambition. Put those two educations together, the con man's understanding of human vulnerability and the Calvinist's iron discipline and systematic thinking. Put them in the same skull behind those pale, still, watchful eyes, and then release that person into one of the most chaotic and opportunity-rich environments in human history. What do you get? You get Standard Oil. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the family moved. They moved several times, the way families with Devil Bill at the head always moved, staying one step ahead of the consequences of his activities. From Richford to Moravia to Owego, New York, and then in 1853, when John was 14 years old, the family moved to the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland in 1853 was a city on the edge of becoming something significant. Sitting on the southern shore of Lake Erie, connected by water to the east and by the new railroads to the west and south, it was the kind of place where a serious young man with good instincts and genuine discipline could find opportunities that would not have been available to him in the small towns of upstate New York. John Rockefeller arrived in Cleveland at 14 years old with a serious face and a quiet manner, and a hunger that he kept so carefully controlled that most people who met him did not recognize it as hunger at all. They thought he was calm. He was not calm. He was waiting. He was 16 years old when he got his first job. Not a remarkable age to start working in 1855. Boys of 16 were considered men in most practical senses. They married, they farmed, they went to war. They made decisions that determined the entire shape of their lives from that point forward. 16 was not young in 1855. It was simply the beginning. But the way John Rockefeller got his first job, and what he did with it once he had it, was already something different from what 16-year-old boys typically did. He spent 3 months looking. Not passively, not by asking around or waiting for someone to offer him something suitable. He walked the streets of Cleveland every single day with the systematic thoroughness of a man conducting a military survey. He visited every merchant, every shipper, every counting house, every firm of any size or apparent stability in the city. He presented himself at each one with the same quiet confidence, the same careful dress, the same serious face that gave nothing away. He asked about positions. He inquired about the nature of the business. He assessed with those pale, observant eyes whether this was a place worth his time. He was 16 years old and already thinking about whether a potential employer was worth his time. Most places turned him away. He was young and had no experience, and Cleveland in 1855 had no shortage of young men looking for work. But Rockefeller was not discouraged by rejection in the way that most people are discouraged by rejection. He did not take it personally. He did not internalize it as a verdict on his worth. He simply noted it, filed it away, and moved to the next address on his mental list. September 26, 1855. He remembered this date for the rest of his life. He celebrated it every year, privately, with more genuine feeling than he gave to his own birthday. He called it Job Day, because on that day, after 3 months of systematic searching, a produce shipping firm called Hewitt and Tuttle offered him a position as an assistant bookkeeper. The salary was negligible. The work was long and detailed and unglamorous. Columns of numbers, invoices, shipping records, the endless paperwork of a mid-sized commercial operation in a growing city. Most young men in his position would have treated it as a temporary situation, a foot in the door on the way to something better, something more exciting, something with more immediate reward. Rockefeller treated it as a university. He learned everything. Not just the bookkeeping he was hired to do, but the entire operation of the business from the ground up. How goods moved from producers to shippers to buyers, where the margins were and why, which customers paid reliably and which ones stretched their credit until it snapped, which suppliers could be trusted and which ones required watching. He stayed late every night, not because he was asked to, but because there was always more to understand, and he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a thing partially understood. His employers noticed. Within a year, they had given him more responsibility. Within 2 years, he was handling accounts that would normally have gone to a much more senior man. He was meticulous in a way that bordered on the obsessive, checking his columns 3 times where other bookkeepers checked them once, never letting a discrepancy pass, no matter how small, treating every penny that passed through his hands as if it were being observed by someone whose opinion mattered to him enormously, which, in his understanding, it was. God was watching the ledger book. He had learned that from his mother, and he kept his books the way a man keeps his books when he genuinely believes that. By 1858, he had saved enough money, combined with a loan from his father, which arrived with an interest rate the devil Bill charged his own son without apparent embarrassment, to go into business for himself. He partnered with a young Englishman named Maurice Clark. They established a small produce commission business, buying and selling grain and hay and meat and other commodities, taking a percentage on each transaction. He was 19 years old. The business was modest, the office was small, and the margins were thin, and there was nothing about the operation of Clark and Rockefeller that would have suggested to any outside observer that one of the partners was going to become the wealthiest private individual in human history. But inside that modest operation, in the daily decisions about which suppliers to trust and which customers to extend credit to, and how tightly to manage costs, and how patiently to build relationships that would eventually become profitable, something was being refined. A method, a way of thinking about business that was already, even at this early stage, different in kind from the way most businessmen thought. Most businessmen in 1858 were opportunists in the straightforward sense. They went where the money was. They followed trends and chased margins and made decisions based on what looked good right now, this week, this season. The American economy of the mid-19th century rewarded this approach well enough. The country was growing so fast that almost any business in almost any sector could find profit if the man running it was not completely incompetent. Rockefeller was thinking differently. He was thinking about systems, about the way all the pieces of a commercial operation fit together, and how controlling the right pieces, not necessarily the most visible pieces, but the most essential ones, gave you leverage over everything connected to them. He was thinking about the difference between a business that made money and a business that could not be stopped from making money. A business so deeply embedded in the necessary infrastructure of economic life that its survival was not a matter of competition, but of gravity. He did not have the vocabulary for this yet. He did not have the industry. He was still buying and selling grain in Cleveland, Ohio, watching the ships come and go on Lake Erie, doing his sums by lamplight every evening with the same careful thoroughness he had brought to everything since he was old enough to hold a pen. But the thinking was already there, behind those quiet eyes, in those meticulously kept ledger books. He was patient in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe, without making it sound like mere passivity, which it absolutely was not. It was the patience of a man who has identified a destination and is moving toward it with complete certainty, who is not in a hurry because he has never once seriously entertained the possibility that he will not arrive. He did not rush. He did not gamble. He did not make the impulsive bets that destroyed so many of his contemporaries, the men who saw opportunity and lunged at it without calculating the risk, who won spectacularly sometimes and lost everything other times. Rockefeller never lunged. He calculated. He waited. He made sure of the ground beneath his feet before he put his weight on it. And then, in 1859, the ground changed entirely. 60 miles south of Cleveland, in a quiet creek valley in northwestern Pennsylvania, a man named Edwin Drake drilled a hole in the ground and struck oil. The world did not immediately understand what had happened. It took a few months for the news to spread, for the first reports to circulate, for the implications to begin to penetrate the consciousness of the commercial world. But when they did, when the realization settled in that there was oil down there, not the small surface seeps that had been known about for years, but a genuine underground reservoir of the stuff, accessible by drilling, extractable in quantities large enough to be commercially significant. The reaction was immediate and total, and almost indistinguishable from madness. Men dropped everything, left jobs, left families, left farms and shops and offices, packed whatever they could carry, and headed for the oil regions of Pennsylvania, with the same wild hunger that had sent men to California a decade earlier, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. The oil rush made the gold rush look orderly by comparison. Within months, the creek valleys of northwestern Pennsylvania were choked with drilling rigs and makeshift refineries and temporary towns that sprang up overnight and disappeared just as fast. Men became millionaires in weeks. Men lost everything in days. The price of oil swung wildly up and down as new wells came in and existing ones ran dry, and nobody had any reliable way to predict which direction it would go next. It was chaos. Glorious, appalling, intoxicating chaos. John Rockefeller went to look at it. He traveled to the oil regions of Pennsylvania, and he walked through the mud and the noise and the smell, and he watched the drilling and the fighting and the desperate gambling of 1,000 men who had come to get rich and had no plan beyond that. He observed it all with his characteristic stillness, taking it in, filing it away, assessing. He did not invest immediately. Everyone around him was investing immediately, throwing money at oil leases and drilling equipment with the frantic urgency of men who believed that hesitation meant losing everything. Rockefeller hesitated. He went back to Cleveland and thought about what he had seen. What he had seen was not opportunity. Not yet. What he had seen was the beginning of something. A new industry in its most raw and chaotic and unformed state. Full of potential and full of destruction in equal measure. The men drilling for oil were making money and losing money with equal randomness. The price of crude was controlled by nothing and no one. The production was erratic, the transportation was primitive, the refining was inconsistent. But somewhere in that chaos, Rockefeller saw something that the men covered in mud and shouting at each other over drilling equipment could not see. He saw a structure that did not yet exist, but that would inevitably have to exist if this industry was going to survive and grow. He saw the shape of the thing that would need to be built. And he saw that the person who built it would own everything. He went back to Cleveland. He returned to his produce business and his careful ledger books and his Sunday church services. He waited 2 more years. He let other men make the early mistakes and absorb the early losses and learn the early lessons at their own expense. And then, in 1863, he invested. Not in oil wells, not in drilling, which was still chaotic and unpredictable and dependent on geological luck that no amount of intelligence or discipline could substitute for. He invested in refining, in the business of taking crude oil out of the ground and turning it into something useful. Kerosene primarily, the refined oil product that was already replacing whale oil in the lamps of American homes at a rate that was beginning to look less like a trend and more like an inevitability. Refining was not glamorous. It did not have the wild romance of striking oil, of the moment when the black liquid came roaring up out of the earth and the driller knew he had found it. It was industrial and systematic and unglamorous, the processing end of the business, the part that turned raw material into usable product. It was exactly the kind of business that John Rockefeller understood instinctively, and that most of the men flooding into the oil industry found deeply uninteresting. He was 24 years old. He had a small stake and a partner and a refinery on the outskirts of Cleveland that was modest by any measure. He was about to become a force of nature. The refinery smelled like the end of the world. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is as close to a literal description as language allows. The early oil refineries of the 1860s were places of extraordinary sensory violence. The smell of crude oil cooking down into kerosene was thick and chemical and penetrating. The kind of smell that settled into your clothes and your hair and the lining of your lungs and stayed there. The air around a refinery shimmered with heat and vapor. The ground was black and slick. The workers moved through it all with the careful, unhurried movements of men who had learned that one wrong step near an open flame meant death. Rockefeller walked through his refinery every day. He did not walk through it the way an owner walks through a property he has purchased, with the satisfied air of a man admiring something that belongs to him. He walked through it the way a surgeon walks through a hospital, looking for anything that was not working at its absolute optimal efficiency. He watched the workers. He watched the equipment. He watched the barrels being filled and the waste products being disposed of, and the fuel being consumed in the heating process. And everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing: waste. The early oil refining industry wasted an almost incomprehensible proportion of everything it processed. Crude oil, when you refine it for kerosene, produces a range of byproducts that the refiners of the 1860s largely did not know what to do with. Heavy residues, lighter fractions, chemical compounds that emerged from the distillation process and were generally piped directly into the nearest river or burned off into the air, because nobody had figured out a use for them yet. Rockefeller looked at the waste and saw money. He hired chemists, which almost no other refinery owner in the 1860s was doing, and set them to work figuring out what the waste products were and what they could be used for. The results were striking. Some of the lighter fractions could be sold as lubricants. Some of the heavier residues could be processed into petroleum jelly, into paraffin wax, into road surfacing materials. Even the barrels themselves, the wooden barrels that crude oil and refined kerosene was shipped in, Rockefeller decided were too expensive to buy from outside suppliers. He built his own barrel-making operation. He bought his own forests to supply the wood. He owned the trees that became the barrels that held the oil that his refineries processed. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the central genius of Standard Oil. Not just refining oil, owning every step of the process, every piece of the system, every link in the chain between the crude oil in the ground and the kerosene burning in the lamp in someone's home in Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York. Vertical integration. That is the economic term for it, but that term, precise and useful as it is, does not capture what it felt like from the inside of the industry. What it felt like to be a competitor watching Rockefeller do this. It felt like watching someone quietly purchase the road you were driving on, and the road behind you, and the road ahead, until one day you looked up and realized that every road you could possibly take ran through land that belonged to him. In 1865, he bought out his partner Maurice Clark and became the sole owner of what was now one of the largest refineries in Cleveland. He was 25 years old and already processing more oil than almost anyone else in the city. But Cleveland was not yet the center of the oil refining world. The center was still in Pennsylvania, close to the wells, where dozens of small refineries were competing frantically and inefficiently for the same crude supply. Rockefeller looked at this landscape and began to think about railroads. The railroads were the nervous system of the American economy in the 1860s and 1870s. Everything moved by rail. Crude oil from the Pennsylvania wells to the refineries. Refined kerosene from the refineries to the cities. The railroad companies were powerful and profitable, and they were, crucially, desperate for large, reliable customers. A refiner who could guarantee to ship a certain volume of product every week was enormously valuable to a railroad. More valuable than 10 small refiners shipping unpredictably and in small quantities. Rockefeller understood this before almost anyone else in his industry did. He went to the railroads and he made them an offer. He would guarantee them a certain volume of shipments, large and regular and reliable, in exchange for a lower per-barrel rate than they charged his competitors. The railroads, eager for the guaranteed business, agreed. They gave Rockefeller rebates, secret discounts off the published shipping rates that his competitors were paying in full. This was not illegal in 1870. It was not even particularly unusual. Railroad rebates were a common tool of commercial negotiation. Large shippers routinely paid less than small ones. That is simply how volume pricing works in any industry. But Rockefeller did not stop there. He negotiated something else from the railroads, something that crossed a line that most businessmen of his era would not have crossed. Not from moral scruple necessarily, but from the failure of imagination that prevented them from seeing that the line could be crossed. He negotiated drawbacks. A drawback was not a discount on his own shipping rates. A drawback was a payment from the railroad to Rockefeller every time one of his competitors shipped oil. Every time a rival refiner put a barrel of kerosene on a train, a portion of what that rival paid the railroad came back to Rockefeller. His competitors were, without knowing it, subsidizing him. Every barrel they shipped made him stronger. Every mile their product traveled made his position more secure. When this eventually became public knowledge, years later, it produced a fury that is difficult to overstate. But in 1870, it was a private arrangement between Rockefeller and the railroad executives, conducted in offices and over dinners, and in the careful language of men who understood that what they were doing was advantageous to both parties and was nobody else's business. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller incorporated Standard Oil of Ohio. The name was deliberate and revealing. Standard. It implied what he intended to impose on the industry. A standard, a uniformity, a single set of practices and prices and methods that would replace the chaos of the current situation with something ordered and predictable and controlled. He genuinely believed, and this is important to understand, that the chaos of the oil industry was bad for everyone. The wild swings in crude prices, the overproduction that periodically crashed the market, the cutthroat competition that drove margins so low that even efficient refiners could barely survive. He believed that consolidation was not just good for Standard Oil. He believed it was good for the industry, for consumers, for the economy. He was not entirely wrong about this. The chaos he described was real, and its effects were genuinely destructive. The oil industry of the late 1860s was consuming itself, producing too much, pricing too low, building too fast, with the manic energy of an industry that had no mechanism for self-regulation and no interest in developing one. But the solution he proposed was not regulation. It was not a cooperative industry association. It was not any kind of arrangement that left the other participants with meaningful independence or power. It was total control. He called it the Cleveland Massacre, and the name, which was not his own, which was given to it by the men who survived it, captures something of what it felt like to be on the receiving end. In the space of 3 months in early 1872, Rockefeller approached 22 of the 26 oil refiners in Cleveland and made each of them the same offer: sell to Standard Oil. Accept his valuation of your business, which was always lower than the owner believed it to be worth, and walk away. Or refuse and face the full weight of what Standard Oil had become. The lower shipping rates, the railroad rebates, the drawbacks, the access to capital that no independent refiner could match. The ability to undercut any price any competitor could offer for as long as it took to drive them out of business. Most of them sold. Some of them wept in his office. Grown men, men who had built their refineries from nothing, who had invested everything they had in their businesses, sitting across a desk from John Rockefeller and understanding, with a clarity that came too late to be useful, that they had already lost, that the contest they thought they were in had ended before they knew it had begun. Rockefeller was not cruel to them, not openly, not in any way that left obvious marks. He was quiet and businesslike, and not unkind. He explained the situation with the patience of a man explaining something complicated to someone who is trying their best to understand. He offered what he considered fair prices. He sometimes offered the sellers positions within Standard Oil, the chance to continue working in the industry they had built their lives around, now as employees of the man who had just absorbed everything they owned. Some of them accepted. Some of them walked away and tried to start again and found, over and over, that the ground had shifted beneath them in ways that made starting again effectively impossible. One man, a refiner named Frank Hewitt, left Rockefeller's office and told a journalist that he had just looked into the eyes of a man who had no conscience, that he had sat across a desk from someone who had thought through every possible move and every possible counter-move with such thoroughness that resistance was not just difficult, it was meaningless. Rockefeller heard about the comment. He did not respond to it publicly. He went home, ate his dinner, attended his Wednesday evening prayer meeting, and returned to his office the next morning to continue the work. By the end of 1872, Standard Oil controlled 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. It was processing a quarter of all the oil refined in the United States. It was 2 years old, and Rockefeller was 32. He was just getting started. The map of the United States in 1875 looked, to most Americans, like a map of a free country. Free markets, free competition, the open promise of a nation built on the idea that any man with enough ambition and enough discipline could build something from nothing, could rise from whatever circumstances he was born into and make himself into whatever he was capable of becoming. This was the American story. The foundational myth. The thing that distinguished the New World from the Old one, with its aristocracies and its inherited titles and its closed systems that kept the born poor permanently poor, regardless of their capability. John Rockefeller believed in this story. He believed in it genuinely, without irony, as a man who had lived it. He had started with almost nothing. He had built something extraordinary through discipline and intelligence and relentless work. The American story was his story. And he saw no contradiction between that belief and what he was doing to the oil industry. Because in his mind, what he was doing to the oil industry was not destroying competition. It was replacing chaos with order, replacing waste with efficiency, replacing a system that was failing everyone with a system that worked. He was not lying to himself. That is the important thing to understand. The self-deception of John Rockefeller, if it was deception at all, was so complete and so structurally integrated into his worldview that it functioned as genuine belief. He thought he was helping. He thought Standard Oil was good for America. He thought the men he ruined were, in a larger sense, being saved from an industry that would have ruined them anyway, just more slowly and more messily, and without the consolation of a buyout check. He thought this right up until the moment a woman named Ida Tarbell sat down at a desk in New York City and began to read his private business records. But that moment was still years away. In 1875, the work of consolidation was still ongoing, and Rockefeller was still moving with the quiet, systematic thoroughness that had characterized everything he had done since he was a 16-year-old boy walking the streets of Cleveland looking for a job worth taking. He had Cleveland. Now he needed everything else. The oil industry in the mid-1870s had three centers of gravity: Cleveland, where Rockefeller already dominated; Pittsburgh, where a cluster of large and well-established refineries operated under men who had been in the business longer than Standard Oil had existed and who had no intention of selling to anyone; and the Pennsylvania oil regions themselves, where the crude came out of the ground and where the pipeline networks that transported it were beginning to replace the railroads as the primary means of moving oil from wellhead to refinery. Pipelines. Rockefeller understood pipelines the way he understood everything else in the oil business, which is to say, more completely and more strategically than anyone else in the industry. A pipeline was not just a more efficient way to move oil than a railroad tank car. A pipeline was infrastructure. It was fixed in the ground. It went where it went and nowhere else. And whoever owned the pipelines controlled the movement of oil in a way that was fundamentally different from the control that railroad rebates provided, deeper and more permanent, and much harder to work around. He began buying pipelines, not quietly, because there was no quiet way to buy the physical infrastructure of an entire industry, but carefully, strategically, identifying the key junctions and the key routes, the pipelines without which the oil of a particular region simply could not move to market, and acquiring those first. Then, using control of those key arteries to apply pressure to everything connected to them. The independent oil producers, the men who actually drilled the wells and pulled the crude out of the ground, began to understand what was happening to them sometime around 1876, and their reaction was visceral and furious and almost entirely ineffective. They formed associations and alliances and pledged to sell only to independent refiners who were not connected to Standard Oil. They lobbied state legislatures for laws that would restrict Standard Oil's ability to operate pipelines as a monopoly. They held meetings in courthouse squares and church halls, where men stood up and gave speeches about the American right to compete freely in a free market. Rockefeller let them talk. He was not contemptuous of them, or not openly. He did not give interviews dismissing their concerns, or make public statements about the inevitability of consolidation, or say anything at all in public about the oil producers or their complaints. He maintained the same careful silence that he maintained about everything. He let his lawyers respond to legal challenges. He let his lieutenants handle the operational details of pipeline acquisition and competitor negotiation. And he sat in his office in Cleveland, later in New York, when Standard Oil moved its headquarters there, and thought about the next step. The next step was always several moves ahead of where everyone else was looking. By 1878, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of the refining capacity of the United States. Not 60%, not 75%, 90%. In 8 years, from the incorporation of Standard Oil in 1870 to 1878, Rockefeller had taken an industry that consisted of hundreds of competing independent operators and compressed it into something that was, for all practical purposes, a single entity under single control. The independent refiners who remained were not competitors in any meaningful sense. They existed because Rockefeller had not yet gotten around to them, or because they occupied niches too small to be worth absorbing, or because their owners had fought with enough legal creativity to delay the inevitable. They were not threats. They were reminders, living demonstrations of what the industry had looked like before Standard Oil, kept alive the way a museum keeps artifacts as evidence of a previous state of things. The railroad executives who had given Rockefeller his original rebate arrangements now found themselves in a relationship that had inverted completely from where it had started. In 1865, Rockefeller had needed the railroads. He had gone to them as a large but not indispensable customer and negotiated favorable terms because he was useful to them and smart enough to understand his own usefulness. By 1878, the railroads needed Standard Oil. Standard Oil was shipping such an overwhelming proportion of all oil moving in the United States that a railroad that lost its Standard Oil contract faced a potentially catastrophic reduction in revenue. The leverage had shifted entirely. Rockefeller now told the railroads what rates he would pay, and the railroads, having no realistic alternative, accepted. He was paying less per barrel to ship oil across the country than it cost the railroad to carry it. The railroads were effectively subsidizing Standard Oil's operations, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was losing the business entirely, and the business was too large to lose. In 1879, Rockefeller's lawyers created a new legal structure to hold the growing empire together: the trust. The Standard Oil Trust
formalized in 1882, was a legal innovation that allowed the stocks of all the various Standard Oil companies operating in different states to be held by a central board of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller as the dominant figure.
It was at the time the largest and most complex business organization in the history of American commerce. It had no real precedent. The lawyers who created it were inventing a new form of corporate organization as they went, improvising legal structures adequate to contain something that existing law had never anticipated needing to contain. The trust controlled not just refineries and pipelines, but the pricing of kerosene across the entire country. When Standard Oil decided that the price of kerosene in Ohio would be 8 cents a gallon, it was 8 cents a gallon. When Standard Oil decided to drop the price in a particular region where an independent refiner was trying to establish itself, the price dropped, below cost if necessary, for as long as necessary, until the independent was gone. Then the price went back up. This practice, predatory pricing, was one of the most effective and most brutal tools in the Standard Oil arsenal. It required something that no independent refiner could match: the ability to absorb losses in one market while profits from all the other markets covered those losses and left the overall enterprise healthy. An independent refiner trying to compete with Standard Oil on price was like a man trying to tire out the ocean by swimming against it. The ocean did not get tired. It simply continued being the ocean until the swimmer stopped. The men who ran the other large American industries of the era watched what Rockefeller was doing with a mixture of awe and hunger. The steel men and the railroad men and the tobacco men and the sugar refiners looked at Standard Oil and saw a template, a proof of concept for something they had all vaguely imagined, but none of them had executed with Rockefeller's completeness. If one man could do this to oil, what could be done to steel, to tobacco, to every other industry that was still operating in the old, chaotic, competitive way, wasting money and energy on competition that benefited nobody, certainly not the men doing the competing? The age of the trusts was beginning. Standard Oil had started it, and the country that prided itself on free markets and open competition was beginning to wake up to the fact that something had happened to those markets while it was not paying close enough attention. Something had happened, and one man had made it happen, and he was sitting in a tall building in New York City, eating a simple lunch at his desk, working through the afternoon's correspondence with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has never once in his life felt that time was running out. Because time was not running out. Not for him. Not yet. But somewhere, in a small office in a magazine building in New York, a woman was sharpening a pencil and opening a file and preparing to do something that all the competing refiners and all the angry oil producers and all the outraged newspaper editorialists and all the state legislators had failed to do. She was preparing to tell the truth about Standard Oil. And the truth, it turned out, was the one thing John D. Rockefeller had no system for containing. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and she is in many ways the most important person in this entire story. Not because she was more powerful than Rockefeller. She was not. Not because she had access to resources that could match his. She had almost nothing by comparison. A desk, a salary from a magazine, and a filing cabinet that was slowly filling with documents. Not because she was louder or angrier or more politically connected than the dozens of men who had tried before her to expose what Standard Oil was doing. She was more dangerous than all of them for one reason. She was more careful. Ida Tarbell grew up in the Pennsylvania oil regions. Her father had been an independent oil producer, one of the men whose livelihood had been systematically dismantled by Standard Oil's pricing practices and pipeline control in the 1870s. She had watched, as a child and a young woman, what Rockefeller's empire did to the communities that depended on independent oil production. She had seen the bankruptcies and the foreclosures and the quiet devastation of towns that had built themselves around an industry that Standard Oil had decided to reorganize according to its own preferences. She did not write about this personal history in her investigation. She kept it almost entirely out of the work, because she understood, with a clarity that her anger might easily have obscured, that personal grievance was not evidence, that what she felt about Standard Oil was irrelevant, that the only thing that mattered, the only thing that would actually penetrate the carefully constructed public image of John D. Rockefeller as a benevolent and God-fearing businessman who had simply been better at his job than everyone else, was documentation. Facts. Specific, verifiable, sourced, documented facts. She spent 5 years getting them. She began in 1900, when the editor of McClure's magazine, one of the most widely read publications in America, asked her to write a short series of articles about Standard Oil. The series was intended to run 3 or 4 installments. It ran 19. It consumed 5 years of her life. It filled 2 volumes when published as a book, and it became arguably the most consequential piece of journalism in American history. She went to the source material, not the newspaper accounts, not the political speeches, not the second-hand testimony of angry competitors. She went to the actual records, court documents from the dozens of lawsuits that had been filed against Standard Oil over the years, congressional testimony from the various investigations that had examined the company's practices, internal railroad records that had been subpoenaed in various legal proceedings and that contained the actual documentation of the rebate and drawback arrangements. She found former Standard Oil employees willing to talk, carefully and with conditions, about what they had seen from the inside. She interviewed oil producers and independent refiners and railroad men and lawyers and politicians, accumulating a body of testimony so large and so internally consistent that it became impossible to dismiss as the complaints of losers and malcontents. She was not writing opinion. She was not editorializing. She was building a case the way a prosecutor builds a case, brick by careful brick, each piece of evidence connected to the next, the whole structure rising slowly toward a conclusion that the reader reached themselves because the facts made it inescapable. Rockefeller did not respond publicly to the articles as they began to appear in McClure's between 1902 and 1904. This was consistent with his lifelong practice of not engaging publicly with criticism. He had never given interviews about Standard Oil's business practices. He had never responded to newspaper attacks, or congressional accusations, or the complaints of ruined competitors. His public persona was carefully maintained and consisted almost entirely of his philanthropic activities, his church attendance, his family life, his golf games, and his occasional remarks about the goodness of God and the importance of hard work. But privately, the articles disturbed him in a way that almost nothing else ever had. He reportedly read each installment as it was published, carefully and completely. He made notes in the margins. He identified factual errors, and there were some, minor ones, that Tarbell later acknowledged and corrected. And he directed his lawyers and his public relations man, one of the first corporate public relations professionals in American history, a man named Joseph Clark, who had been hired specifically to manage Rockefeller's image, to respond to those errors through intermediaries. He called Tarbell Miss Tarbell in private conversations, with a careful courtesy that was itself a form of dismissal, as if the proper form of address was a sufficient response to the content of what she was writing. He told associates that she was a misguided woman driven by personal animosity, that her work was inaccurate and unfair, that Standard Oil had built the modern oil industry, and that the people complaining about it were simply the inefficient operators who had been unable to compete in a fair market. He believed this. Some part of him, the part that had never really examined the mechanisms by which Standard Oil had achieved its dominance from the perspective of the people those mechanisms had destroyed, genuinely believed it. Tarbell's articles reached millions of readers. McClure's was not a radical publication. It was not a fringe outlet with a political agenda. It was a mainstream, widely respected magazine, read by exactly the kind of middle-class Americans whose opinion about trusts and monopolies and the concentration of economic power had been, up to this point, largely unformed. They knew Standard Oil existed. They bought its kerosene. They had heard vague things about its methods. But they had not understood, in the specific and documented way that Tarbell's work made it impossible not to understand, exactly what those methods were. They understood now. The public response was significant and growing. But the response that mattered most came from Washington. Theodore Roosevelt had become President of the United States in 1901, following the assassination of William McKinley, and he was a man with a set of convictions about the power of large corporations that placed him on a direct collision course with everything Standard Oil represented. Roosevelt was not a socialist. He was not opposed to capitalism or to large businesses or to the accumulation of private wealth in principle. But he believed, with the genuine conviction of a man who had thought carefully about the relationship between economic power and democratic government, that concentrations of corporate power beyond a certain scale became threats to the political freedom of ordinary citizens. He called them malefactors of great wealth. He meant Rockefeller, among others, but he meant Rockefeller specifically, and Standard Oil specifically, and the model of corporate organization that Standard Oil represented generally. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the law passed in 1890 that prohibited business combinations in restraint of trade. The suit accused Standard Oil of exactly what Tarbell had documented: the secret railroad arrangements, the predatory pricing, the systematic elimination of competition through methods that went beyond legitimate business competition into deliberate economic coercion. The legal proceedings took 4 years. They generated thousands of pages of testimony and documentary evidence. They required the examination of the internal records of the most complex private business organization in the history of American commerce. They involved some of the most skilled lawyers on both sides that American jurisprudence could produce. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly in restraint of trade and ordered it to be dissolved. The empire that Rockefeller had spent 40 years building, the structure that controlled 90% of American oil refining, the pipelines and the tankers and the marketing networks and the chemical operations and the real estate and all the 100 interconnected pieces of the most comprehensively integrated industrial organization the world had ever seen, was to be broken into 34 separate companies. The ruling was celebrated across America as a victory for democracy and the free market and the ordinary citizen against the overreaching power of concentrated wealth. Newspapers ran jubilant headlines. Politicians gave speeches about the restoration of competition. The men who had been ruined by Standard Oil, or their sons if the men themselves had not survived to see it, allowed themselves a moment of something that felt almost like justice. Rockefeller was playing golf when he heard the news. He was 71 years old. He had retired from the active management of Standard Oil years earlier, handing day-to-day control to a lieutenant named John Archbold, while he retreated to his estate and his philanthropic activities and his golf and his careful daily routines. He was already by 1911 in the process of becoming something different from what he had been. No longer the operator of an empire, but the administrator of a fortune, overseeing through his philanthropic foundations the distribution of wealth on a scale that had no precedent in American history. He heard the Supreme Court ruling, and he finished his golf game. Then he went inside and told the people around him with the same quiet certainty he had brought to every pronouncement of his life, that the dissolution of Standard Oil into 34 separate companies was going to make him considerably wealthier. He was right. The 34 companies that Standard Oil became were, each of them, worth more as independent entities than they had been as divisions of the whole. The stock prices of the successor companies rose dramatically after the dissolution. Rockefeller, who owned a significant stake in all of them, watched his net worth increase substantially in the years following the ruling that was supposed to have broken his power. Among the 34 successor companies were organizations that would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and a dozen other names that are still, more than a century later, among the largest corporations on Earth. The empire was not destroyed, it was multiplied. And the man who built it was sitting on a golf course in Ohio. An old man in a cardigan, thin and pale and almost completely bald, smiling his thin, careful smile at a small white ball sitting on a perfect square of green grass. He had won. Even losing, he had won. Even broken apart by the highest court in the land, the thing he had built was still running, still operating, still pumping oil and refining kerosene and generating wealth on a scale that the ruling against it had done nothing to diminish. That is what it meant to build something the way John Rockefeller built things. You built it so that even its destruction was a form of continuation. He lived to be 97 years old. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. The man who built Standard Oil, who was born in 1839 in a farmhouse in upstate New York when Abraham Lincoln was a prairie lawyer and the American Civil War was still 2 decades away, died in 1937, the year that Franklin Roosevelt was beginning his second term and the first jet engine was being tested in England, and the world was lurching toward a second catastrophic war. He was born into a world lit by candles and whale oil, and he died in a world of electric lights and automobiles and commercial radio and transatlantic telephone calls. He outlasted almost everyone who had known him as a young man. He outlasted most of his enemies. He outlasted Ida Tarbell, though only by 2 years, and he outlasted Theodore Roosevelt by 18. He outlasted the era that had made him and the era that had tried to unmake him, and he arrived, finally, in a world so thoroughly shaped by the industry he had built that most of the people living in it had no clear sense of where the modern world ended and the Standard Oil legacy began. Because those two things were, by then, essentially the same thing. But before we talk about the legacy, we need to talk about the man himself in his last decades, because the story of Rockefeller's old age is, in its own quiet way, as strange and as revealing as the story of his rise. It is the story of a man who spent the second half of his life trying to give away what the first half had accumulated, and discovering that giving away $400 billion worth of wealth is, if anything, harder than making it. He had begun giving money away before he had money to give. That ledger book from his first job, the one he kept from the age of 16 and maintained for the rest of his life, shows charitable donations beginning with his very first paycheck. A few cents here, $1 there, always at least 10% of everything he earned going to his church and to local charitable causes. This was not strategic philanthropy in the modern sense. It was religious obligation. The Baptist faith of his mother demanded tithing, and he tithed, consistently and without fanfare, even when he could barely afford to. As his wealth grew, the giving grew with it. By the 1880s, he was donating hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. By the 1890s, millions. And the requests for money were coming in at a rate that was, by any human measure, completely unmanageable. Thousands of letters a week from churches and schools and hospitals and individuals and organizations of every conceivable kind, all of them making their case for why John D. Rockefeller's money should come to them. He hired a man to help him manage the giving. Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister turned philanthropic advisor, who became one of the most important figures in Rockefeller's life and one of the most consequential philanthropists in American history. Gates brought to the management of Rockefeller's charitable giving the same systematic thinking that Rockefeller had brought to the management of Standard Oil. He did not simply respond to requests. He identified areas where large infusions of capital could produce transformative results. He studied problems the way Rockefeller studied industries, looking for the leverage points, the places where money applied with sufficient intelligence and sufficient scale could change entire systems rather than merely helping individual cases. The University of Chicago was founded with Rockefeller money in 1890. He gave it more than $35 million over the course of his life, an amount that in today's terms would be several billion dollars. And the university he funded became one of the great research institutions of the 20th century, producing dozens of Nobel laureates and fundamentally shaping American intellectual life. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901 and eventually renamed Rockefeller University, was more consequential still. At the time of its founding, American medicine was in a state that would be almost unrecognizable today. There were no antibiotics. The germ theory of disease was only a few decades old and still not universally accepted by practicing physicians. Medical training was largely unregulated and enormously variable in quality. The average American doctor in 1901 had received training that would not qualify him to be a nurse's aide in a modern hospital. The Rockefeller Institute poured money into medical research on a scale that had no precedent in American history. It funded the development of treatments for meningitis, for typhus, for yellow fever, for syphilis. It funded the research that eventually led to the discovery of blood types, making blood transfusions safe for the first time. It funded the public health campaigns that dramatically reduced hookworm disease in the American South, a parasitic infection that had been quietly undermining the health and cognitive development of millions of poor rural Americans for generations. The estimates of how many lives the Rockefeller philanthropy saved, directly and indirectly, through medical research and public health work alone, run into the hundreds of millions. This is not a small thing. It is not a footnote. It is one of the central facts of the Rockefeller story, and it sits in genuine and uncomfortable tension with the other central facts. The man who destroyed independent refiners through predatory pricing also funded the research that saved hundreds of millions of lives from infectious disease. These two things are both true. They are both the same man. And the attempt to resolve that tension, to find the narrative that makes one of these facts cancel out the other, is exactly the wrong way to engage with the story. The tension is the story. He developed, in his old age, a strange and rather touching set of daily habits that suggested something about the inner life he had always kept so carefully hidden. He loved golf with a genuine and uncomplicated passion that seems to have been one of the few areas of his life where the calculating mind simply switched off, and he was present in the immediate physical pleasure of the thing. He played almost every day in good weather. He gave golf lessons to anyone who expressed interest, including journalists who came to interview him. And the image of John D. Rockefeller patiently explaining the mechanics of a golf swing to a reporter who had come to ask him about monopoly practices is one of the more surreal in the historical record. He gave away dimes, literally. He carried rolls of new dimes with him everywhere he went, and pressed them into the hands of caddies and servants and children and strangers he passed on the street. The dime, in the early 20th century, was not a trivial sum for many of the people who received them. It was a gesture of personal connection from a man who had spent most of his life operating at a scale so large that personal connection had been largely irrelevant to his work. The dimes were his way of being present in individual human lives, of participating in the small transactions of daily human existence from which his wealth had long since removed him. The journalists who came to interview him in his old age consistently reported the same thing. They expected to find the monster of the Standard Oil exposés, the cold, calculating predator who had wept with ruined competitors and then absorbed their businesses. They expected to find someone who felt like power, who radiated the intimidating force of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. Instead, they found a thin, quiet, almost delicate old man who wanted to talk about golf and God and the importance of fresh air and moderate eating, who smiled easily and often, who deflected every question about Standard Oil and its methods with a practiced gentleness that was somehow more disconcerting than defensiveness would have been, who spoke about his wealth as a stewardship, a responsibility given to him by God that he was doing his best to discharge wisely, and who seemed to genuinely believe every word of this. The question of whether John Rockefeller had a conscience is one that serious historians and biographers have been arguing about for more than a century, without reaching anything like consensus. The evidence points in two directions simultaneously and with equal force. On one side, the lifelong religious devotion that appears by every measure available to have been genuine rather than performed. The charitable giving that began before he had money and continued without interruption until his death. The personal kindness reported by virtually everyone who knew him in private life. The letters to his children that are full of warmth and humor and genuine tenderness. The marriage of 50 years that appears to have been genuinely loving. On the other side, the drawbacks, the predatory pricing, the men who wept in his offers, the communities destroyed by Standard Oil's methods, the systematic, deliberate, cold-blooded dismantling of competitors who had done nothing wrong except occupy a space that Standard Oil wanted. Both sides of this ledger are real, Neither cancels the other. And the man who kept his actual ledger books with such obsessive precision managed, somehow, to keep these two accounts entirely separate in his own mind for the entirety of his 97 years. He never, in any letter or diary entry or reported conversation, expressed genuine remorse for what Standard Oil had done to its competitors. He expressed, occasionally, a mild regret that people had misunderstood his intentions, that the methods he had used had been necessary rather than chosen, that the men who had been ruined would have been ruined anyway by the chaos of the industry if Standard Oil had not been there to absorb them into something more stable. He died on May 23, 1937, at his estate in Ormond Beach, Florida. The cause of death was arteriosclerosis. He had been in declining health for years, his body finally beginning to fail after nearly a century of careful maintenance and moderate living, and the kind of disciplined attention to physical well-being that had characterized everything else he did. He died quietly in his sleep, which seemed appropriate for a man who had always done his most consequential work in silence. His estate was valued at approximately $26 million. This seems at first like a shockingly small number for a man who had been worth $400 billion in today's money at his peak. But it reflects the scale of the giving. He had spent the last 4 decades of his life distributing his fortune with the same systematic efficiency with which he had accumulated it. The $26 million was what was left after he had given away more than $500 million, an amount that in today's terms represents a philanthropic enterprise of almost incomprehensible scale. The companies that Standard Oil had become were still operating. They were larger in many cases than Standard Oil itself had been at its peak. Exxon and Mobil and Chevron and the others were pumping oil not just from Pennsylvania, but from Texas and California and the Middle East and the North Sea, and eventually from every oil-bearing formation on the planet. The pipelines ran further, the tankers were larger, the refineries were more sophisticated. The reach of the industry that Rockefeller had organized and systematized and made into the template for modern corporate organization extended to every corner of the earth. His name was on buildings and universities and medical research institutes. His methods were in the DNA of every large corporation that came after him. The vertical integration, the systematic elimination of inefficiency, the understanding that controlling the infrastructure of an industry was more powerful than controlling any individual part of it. And his dimes were in the pockets of caddies and children across the eastern United States. Small, bright circles of silver that had passed through the hands of the wealthiest man who ever lived, and now paid for penny candy and bus fares and the small daily transactions of ordinary human life. The oil is still running, through pipelines that follow routes he chose, through refineries built on land his company acquired, processed by methods his chemists developed, priced by markets that operate within a structure his lawyers and his business methods helped create. The names have changed. The logos have changed. The men sitting in the tall buildings making the decisions have changed. Generation after generation, faces and names cycling through the corner offices, while the underlying structure endures. But somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the quarterly earnings reports and the geopolitical negotiations and the environmental impact assessments and the stock prices ticking up and down on electronic screens, there is the ghost of a system, comprehensive and patient and absolute. Built by a man who understood, earlier and more completely than anyone else in his era, that the way to own an industry was not to win at competition, but to make competition irrelevant. That understanding did not die with him. It never dies. It simply finds new industries, new leverage points, new names for the same ancient hunger. The hunger that drove a boy who watched his father disappear down a dirt road in rural New York, to build something so large and so durable that a century of regulation and dissolution and public fury could not unmake it. He wanted control. Not the flashy, visible, announced control of kings and conquerors. The quiet kind. The kind that operates through infrastructure and contracts and the patient accumulation of every piece that anyone else might need. The kind that makes itself felt not through force, but through the simple, irresistible logic of dependency. The kind that you do not notice until you try to move without it and discover that you cannot. The world runs on oil. It has run on oil since the first well came in at Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. And it runs on oil still, a century and a half later, despite every effort to change that fundamental dependency. The automobiles and the aeroplanes and the plastics and the pharmaceuticals and the fertilizers that feed the world and the synthetic fibers in the clothes on your back. All of it traces back, in one way or another, to the substance that John Rockefeller decided to organize and control before anyone else understood what organizing and controlling it would mean. He did not discover oil. He did not invent the refining process. He did not drill the first well or lay the first pipeline or devise the chemistry that turned crude petroleum into useful products. He simply understood, before anyone else did, that the person who controlled the system would own everything the system touched. And then he built the system. Close your eyes now. Somewhere beneath you, beneath the floor and the foundation and the soil and the bedrock, there are pipelines, running in directions you have never thought about, carrying substances you use every day without considering where they come from or how they got to you, or what it cost, in human terms, to build the network that delivers them. They have been running for a long time. They were running before you were born. They will be running long after everyone alive today is gone. That is what it means to build something the way John D. Rockefeller built things, Not for a lifetime, not for a generation, not even for a century. Forever. Or as close to forever as human ambition has ever managed to get. Sleep well.